The war was over. Berlin was in ruins. Hitler was dead, but his money was still missing. Where did the millions he made from Mein Kampf go? Who moved the accounts? What happened to the valuables he accumulated during 12 years of absolute power? Nothing was declared. There was no valid will. There were no recognized heirs. Meanwhile, watches, paintings, and signed documents began to circulate on the black market. Some were sold, others were kept secret, others disappeared forever. This isn't a documentary about how Hitler got rich. It's an in-depth investigation into what happened to it all afterward. Because when the Third Reich fell, someone kept what was left. And this is the story of the loot that was never claimed, of the money that left no trace, in addition of a lost legacy that no one officially inherited. The cursed legacy, what Hitler left behind when he died. In the final days of April 1945, Adolf Hitler remained locked underground in a reinforced shelter beneath the Chancellery, while Berlin was trapped between gunfire, fires, and enemy soldiers. There, he drafted a will divided into 3 sections: a political document, a private letter, and the distribution of his belongings. In those lines, he left written that everything he owned should go to the National Socialist Party. If the organization no longer existed, it would pass to the German state. Hours later, he fell in Berlin. The fall of the regime occurred so quickly that there was no valid structure that could assume what he had ordered. The party was completely dissolved, and the state was divided into zones of military control. Martin Bormann, designated to enforce his instructions, fled the bunker and was never seen alive again. Hitler's will, on paper, had no way of being executed. Hitler had amassed an enormous personal fortune during his time in power. His wealth came not only from his salary as head of state, it included royalties from the massive sales of his book, speaking fees, party income, and donations channeled as gifts from businessmen and sympathizers. Some of this money was distributed in accounts under third-party names. There were also properties, vehicles, expensive furniture, and stolen art. All of this formed a capital that, at the time of his death, had no direct heir or legal basis to protect it. In the days following his death, the Allied forces launched an operation to locate and secure the assets of senior Nazi officials. In the southern part of the country, the US military administration ordered a review of all files related to Hitler's personal property. The apartment in Munich was seized by Bavarian authorities. The house at the Berghof had been bombed by British aircraft and then looted by neighbors and soldiers. What remained was a ruin. The valuables that were not destroyed began to circulate on illegal markets. In a short time, engraved watches, portraits, uniforms, furniture, and even kitchen utensils from the Berghof appeared at clandestine auctions. Almost nothing remained in official hands. The sheer volume of documents destroyed by direct orders from Hitler's entourage in the final days made it impossible to know precisely how much he owned, where it was, and in what form it was stored. The document drafted by Hitler on April 29th indicated that the properties were to be used to continue the party's ideological work. No specific sums, accounts, or assets were mentioned. This vagueness, coupled with Bormann's disappearance, rendered his last will and testament null and void. The Allied military authorities did not recognize the party as a valid entity, and the German state was dismantled. No one could officially claim anything. Amid this confusion, it was the regional government of Bavaria that assumed control of the assets within its territory. Among them were the building where Hitler had lived in Munich and some publishing rights associated with Mein Kampf. For decades, the profits obtained from that book on German soil were retained by the Bavarian state and allocated to social and educational programs. The publication and distribution of the text were blocked until the copyright expired in 2016. Assets located outside the country were more difficult to trace. Hitler was known to have ordered transfers to bank accounts in Switzerland, taking advantage of financial confidentiality laws. There were also deposits of cash, bullion, artwork, and valuables protected in foreign vaults. But many of these clues were lost when the documents recording them were destroyed before the German surrender. The person in charge of managing his financial affairs had been Max Amann, a former army comrade who later headed the party publishing house. Amann handled income from book sales, image rights, payments for speeches, and even products printed with Hitler's image. Much of this income did not pass through official state channels. It was money without external control, used at will to buy property, finance personal projects, or fill private accounts. During the final years of the war, several of Hitler's close aides were involved in moving valuables to locations considered safe. Some of the art destined for the museum Hitler planned to build in Linz was hidden in mines, tunnels, and castles in southern Germany and Austria. Although some items were recovered by the Allies, others were lost. Many disappeared with the men protecting them. Others were stolen by the troops who found them. Subsequent investigations attempted to follow the money trail through banks. But banks in Switzerland, Liechtenstein, and other jurisdictions used protection mechanisms that concealed the true names of the owners. The US government managed to identify and seize some payments from foreign publishers for royalties from Mein Kampf, but the total sum barely reached $250,000. It was a tiny fraction compared to the rest of the fortune. After the end of the war, the occupation authorities in each zone established commissions to review the assets of the Nazi state and Hitler's inner circle. However, the complete collapse of the regime, the mass burning of archives, and the death or flight of key witnesses prevented the true extent of the dictator's personal wealth from being known. Some reports estimated that, adjusted to current values, the amount could exceed $5 billion. But there were no accounting records to confirm this figure. Attempts to locate works of art, furniture, bank accounts, or jewelry yielded no consistent results. Some pieces reappeared decades later in private collections or public sales. Others were never recovered, and many more changed hands without a trace. In the absence of legal documents signed by valid witnesses, most of the assets were absorbed into the post-war chaos. Hitler left no immediate family members with rights to his possessions. His living relatives were not recognized heirs in his will, nor could they claim assets from the Allied governments. This made it easier for the states where his properties were located to legally appropriate what remained without anyone being able to challenge the decision. The Munich apartment was used by the regional government for public offices. Some furniture remained in state archives. The ruins of the Berghof were sealed and later demolished. The Eagle's Nest, located in a mountain resort area, was converted into a restaurant and visitor center. No original artifacts were preserved. Everything belonging to Hitler was removed or sold. Up to that point, the process was more administrative than judicial. There was no trial over the assets, nor was it divided between parties. The little that was found was managed by the occupation authorities or passed into the hands of the Bavarian government. Unlike other Nazi leaders who had families claiming property, in Hitler's case there was no such debate. His fortune dissolved amid bombings, burning papers, and looting. The will Hitler dictated underground was reviewed by the Allies in various locations. The copy given to the Soviets by Heinz Linger, his personal assistant, matched the one the Americans obtained from the rubble of the bunker. Both contained the same wish list: that his belongings be used to continue the party's thinking, and that his image not become an object of worship. Nothing in these texts indicated exact numbers, locations, or access codes. There was no inventory. The Soviet authorities who took control of the bunker in Berlin searched for traces of hidden gold, money, or files. They found burned papers, broken furniture, and empty rooms. Hitler's body had been partially incinerated, making any inspection difficult. In the classified reports that years later became known as the Hitler Book, it was documented that there were no signs of accumulated wealth at the place where he spent his final hours. Interrogations of direct witnesses yielded no clear clues. Otto Günscher and Heinz Linger, who were with Hitler until the end, asserted that he had not provided information about vaults, keys, or escape plans. According to their statements, the little that was not destroyed remained visible to all: a few weapons, documents of no practical value, and personal clothing. The rest had been lost in the evacuation or destroyed by his aides on direct orders. In the United States, the government applied the Trading with the Enemy Act to seize any assets Hitler had generated in Allied territory. Under this measure, nearly $255,000 in royalties from Mein Kampf were seized, corresponding to payments made by British and American publishers. The money was redirected to refugee relief funds. It was one of the few documented sums that could be directly linked to him and ended up in public hands. In Germany, the Bavarian administration controlled the book's copyright from 1945 to 2016. During that time, the text was censored and its distribution prohibited. The profits it generated through special permits were channeled into educational and academic activities. Not a single payment was made to any individual as an heir. The remaining assets, including land, houses, and luxury items, were assumed by the state without trial. In practice, Hitler's estate was left without valid claimants. His family, scattered and disconnected, was not listed as beneficiaries in any document, and no other party member had the legal power to execute his will, as the organization had been dissolved and declared illegal by the Allies. During the 1950s, the Western powers withheld the little information they managed to obtain about his assets. It was known that he had had contact with Swiss banks and that some of the money obtained from book sales and private donations had left Germany. But the transfers, made in cash or through front companies, were impossible to trace without the collaboration of the financial institutions involved. That collaboration never occurred. Broader investigations began in the 1990s with the advancement of declassified files and international pressure on European banks to reveal accounts related to the Nazi regime. Even so, no sums attributed directly to Hitler were recovered. Institutions that handled accounts under encrypted names argued that the records had been eliminated during the war or shortly afterward. Historians who have attempted to calculate the total value of his fortune arrive at widely varying estimates. Some speak of figures that would exceed $5 billion in today's dollars. But without documents, these figures have no exact support. What is clear is that Hitler lived surrounded by luxury, financed with money from the party, the state, and private contributions. These funds were not controlled by any audit and were managed as his personal treasury. The Berghof, which was his most famous residence, had been remodeled with party funds. The works of art that decorated it were mostly pieces confiscated from Jewish collectors or acquired at forced prices. The furniture, tableware, vehicles, and staff that served him were paid with funds that were never registered as public. All of this disappeared within weeks of his death. Hitler's personal belongings were dispersed throughout Europe and America. A red telephone bearing his name was auctioned for over $200,000. A gold-encrusted pistol sold for several million. The globe in his office was acquired by collectors. None of these pieces were part of an inheritance lawsuit. All were smuggled out of the country by soldiers, visitors, or looters who took them as souvenirs. Some assets of great historical and artistic value were recovered and returned to museums or affected families. But the bulk of Hitler's assets disappeared without a trace. Neither the Allied governments, the German state, nor the descendants of his officials were able to locate his entire estate. It was dispersed in secret warehouses, private sales, fires, or deliberate destruction. The fate of his fortune ended up in the hands of chaotic circumstances. There was no planning. There was no structured safeguarding. Everything that wasn't burned or looted was lost in the collapse. Unlike other leaders who managed to evacuate assets to South America or Asia, Hitler stayed until the very end without activating any retirement plan. His money didn't leave with him, nor was it bequeathed to anyone. For the Soviets, the objects found in the bunker were stored under strict guard, away from the public. For decades, Moscow denied possessing any remains or belongings of the dictator. Only after the fall of the Soviet bloc were details such as the preservation of his jawbone and bone fragments confirmed, but records of tangible assets linked to his fortune were never revealed. The myth of a hidden treasure fueled theories and searches for years. Tunnels, lakes, and abandoned mines were explored. Some pieces turned up, others never did. The truth is that most of the money Hitler had amassed vanished in the same chaos that consumed the Third Reich. His properties, his accounts, and his art collection were divided up, destroyed, or simply forgotten. What remained was a small group of documents, a few photos, a couple of objects in display cases, and many gaps in the archives. The man who had built boundless wealth through power left nothing but loose fragments and unanswered questions. There was no inheritance. There was no economic legacy, only ruins, silence, and remains scattered across countries, archives, and private collections. Gold, art, and property, tracing physical assets. Hitler's wealth was not limited to accounts or publishing payments. It included houses, vehicles, relics, stolen art, and artifacts scattered across several regions. A significant portion of these assets was located by the Allied occupation forces, but others remained unaccounted for. The operation to track down each possession was complicated by the destruction of archives, massive looting, and the deliberate elimination of evidence. One of the first sites raided was Hitler's Munich apartment. The place was confiscated by the Bavarian state and transformed into a public office. He had lived there before becoming chancellor. Furniture, paintings, documents, and ornaments were removed. Some pieces were stored by the new authorities. Others disappeared without a record. No complete inventory was compiled before the move. Another key site was the Berghof, his private residence in the Bavarian Alps. The property had been purchased by him in 1928 and expanded with party money once he came to power. It included bedrooms, terraces, an underground bunker, gardens, and reception rooms. It was decorated with tapestries, luxurious furniture, porcelain, and dozens of works of art. All of this was destroyed in the air raids and subsequent looting. British aircraft bombed the complex in April 1945. Days later, French and American soldiers entered the site and seized what they found. Some objects were taken to storage, others were stolen and ended up in private markets. A few months later, groups of local residents and occasional looters finished clearing out what remained. The remains of the building were demolished by order of the Bavarian government in the 1950s. The Eagle's Nest, a structure built on top of Mount Kehlstein, was also invaded. This structure, created as a gift by the party for his 50th birthday, was financed by donations and state funds. Unlike the Berghof, it was not destroyed. The building remained standing and was converted into a restaurant and tourist attraction. It retained no original furnishings or decorations. Anything of value was removed before opening to the public. Hitler also owned customized cars. He commissioned several modified Mercedes-Benz models with armor plating and exclusive details. The vehicles were registered in the name of the party but were used only by him. After the defeat, some of these cars were recovered by the Allies. Others were sold as collectibles. Some remain in museums, but several more disappeared without being registered. Art was an essential part of his heritage. Hitler had ordered the systematic collection of paintings, sculptures, and valuable objects with the goal of building a museum in Linz. The project, known as the Führer Museum, never materialized, but tens of thousands of pieces were seized. Many came from Jewish families forced to sell or who were directly dispossessed. The rest were obtained through forced purchase, political exchange, or outright theft. Most of these works were moved to underground storage. Some lots were hidden in salt mines and tunnels in southern Germany and Austria. American forces advancing eastward discovered several of these hiding places. Operations to recover the pieces were carried out by special units. Some were returned to their original owners. Others passed into the hands of the Allied government, but a considerable portion was never found. The looting was managed by specialized agents. Hitler delegated these tasks to party officials and trusted officials. They selected pieces, organized transfers, and documented acquisitions. The system was designed to consolidate a personal collection that would reinforce his image as a cultural leader. The selected pieces were evaluated according to his artistic preferences. He rejected modern art and favored classical styles, landscapes, portraits, and historical scenes. In some cases, the owners were forced to sign documents handing over the works in exchange for symbolic sums. In others, they were simply deprived. On several occasions, objects were taken directly from museums in occupied territories. Works that had been protected in war shelters were also seized. All of this was part of the artistic loot accumulated during the German expansion in Europe. After the surrender, Allied troops found part of this collection. The recovered archives contained lists, photographs, and files that helped identify their origins. However, many pieces were not in their designated locations. They had been moved, stolen, or destroyed. The lack of control during the final days of the conflict prevented the complete recovery. Some works reappeared decades later in private hands or galleries. The Monuments Men Property Commission, created by the United States, coordinated efforts to rescue and return the stolen art. They managed to recover a significant portion of the collections of Hitler, Goering, and other regime leaders, but they were unable to trace all the shipments. Smaller objects such as clocks, signed books, minor sculptures, and porcelain pieces were dispersed without a trace. In addition to art, Hitler accumulated furniture, tapestries, tableware, carpets, musical instruments, decorative weapons, and luxury items that were used in his residences and offices. All were purchased with party funds or acquired through state-owned enterprises. They were not recorded as personal property. Therefore, at the time of the collapse, there were no legal documents indicating their formal ownership. Many of these objects were taken as trophies by Allied soldiers. Some were sent as gifts to high-ranking officials. Others were sold by collectors on the black market. There were also cases in which pieces disappeared from state warehouses without a record. The lack of reliable inventories prevented the establishment of a complete list of what existed before the fall of the regime. The Allied governments did not apply a unified protocol on what to do with these assets. Different decisions were made in each zone of occupation. While the United States established recovery and cataloging units, the Soviet Union kept the objects in secret custody. In many cases, they refused to share information with the Western powers. This prevented the reconstruction of the root of hundreds of pieces. The magnitude of the cultural heritage Hitler had amassed was enormous. According to some reports recovered by the Allies, there were more than 12,000 works under his direct control. Some were in documented depots, others in private homes, and others in transit between occupied territories. When the system collapsed, much of this treasure disappeared. Aside from art, attempts were also made to trace bullion, coins, jewelry, and precious metals that might have been part of Hitler's personal treasure. Some reports indicated that Hitler had stashes in safe deposit boxes, but no firm proof was ever found. The amounts that could be recovered were minor. No vaults, hidden caches, or secret deposits in his name were found. Among the missing personal items were medals, photo albums, signed letters, engraved watches, and collectibles. Some soldiers sold them as war souvenirs, others kept them secret for decades. Several reappeared at international auctions without documents confirming their origin. The difficulty in tracing their authenticity complicated their legal recovery. In several cases, the objects were displayed as part of historical exhibitions, with no claims from the German state. There was no legal basis to reclaim them, as many were not registered as state property or personal heirlooms. The legal vacuum created after the collapse of the regime left everything that had not been officially documented unprotected. The presence of these objects in private hands grew over time. From the 1970s onward, the market for Nazi-related objects began to expand. Uniforms, insignia, furniture, tableware, documents, and personal items supposedly linked to Hitler or his entourage were on offer. Many pieces were authentic, others were forgeries. There was no institutional oversight to assess their provenance. The trade in these types of objects generated legal debate in several countries. Some governments banned the sale of items with Nazi symbols, others permitted it under certain conditions. In Germany, legislation prohibits the display or distribution of content related to the Third Reich for propaganda purposes. However, private possession of original objects is not criminalized. This facilitated the transfer of many goods without registration. The difficulty in tracing the object's roots was compounded by the use of intermediaries and their passage through neutral zones. During the war, several shipments were diverted to countries such as Switzerland, Sweden, Spain, and Portugal. There they remained out of the reach of the Allied powers. Years later, they were sold through discreet channels, with hidden identities and incomplete documentation. In other cases, the goods were transported in military convoys, private trucks, or trains. Some pieces disappeared in transit. Others were confiscated by Allied troops without any official record. Differences between Soviet, American, British, and French occupation protocols prevented joint tracking. Each country acted separately, making comprehensive control difficult. The files recovered by Allied troops included partial lists of works of art, furniture, and decorative objects, but many were outdated. Constant relocations during the war and the destruction of final documents left gaps that were impossible to fill. Experts attempting to reconstruct the inventory worked with incomplete copies, contradictory reports, and inaccurate testimony. Austrian castles, monasteries, abandoned mines, and alpine huts were used as temporary storage facilities. Hidden works were discovered among boxes, tunnels, and sealed chambers. In some cases, the natural environment had deteriorated the materials. In others, the objects were intact, but there were also empty structures. They were known to have been used as hiding places, but they no longer contained anything. Someone had emptied them before the troops arrived. Recovery was uneven. While in Austria and Germany the Allied forces were able to intervene directly, In other countries, cooperation was limited. The works taken east remained in Soviet hands. Many of them were never returned. They were stored in state museums, secret archives, or security collections. Moscow denied possessing any of this material for years. The documentation found by the Americans revealed that Hitler had received regular reports on the state of his collection. He was sent catalogues, lists, photographs, and technical sheets. But these archives disappeared along with his personal library. Only fragments were recovered. The most valuable pieces had been removed before the troops reached the storage sites. During the investigation, several officials in charge of the logistical management of the assets were identified. Some were arrested, others disappeared. The statements collected at the Nuremberg trials and subsequent interrogations made it possible to trace some transport routes, but they were not enough to reconstruct the complete route. The pieces that remained in state hands were classified. Some went to museums, others remained in official storage. In exceptional cases, governments attempted to return works to their original owners or their heirs, but the lack of evidence and the legal complexity of the processes meant that many returns failed. The case of the stolen art became one of the most visible aspects of the physical trail of Hitler's fortune. The works were tangible, visible, and traceable, but they were also protected by institutional silence, the lack of records, and the passivity of several states. Years of investigation were required to prove their provenance. And even then, the legal process for recovering them was complex. In comparison, other physical assets such as vehicles, furniture, or decorative weapons were more difficult to trace. They changed hands quickly, left the country in suitcases, were sold as souvenirs, or exchanged between soldiers. There was no official database grouping them together. Each object followed an individual path. Ingots, coins, and precious metals attributable to Hitler's entourage were also not recovered in large quantities. Investigations indicated that some of these assets may have been melted down or transformed before being detected. In other cases, they were used to bribe, pay for escape routes, or finance clandestine networks, but there was no direct evidence linking these movements to Hitler. The looting and dispersal of Hitler's possessions was so extensive that many objects continue to appear today. Some turn up in antique markets. Others are handed in by families who kept them without knowing their exact origin. Pieces have also been recovered through anonymous reports or raids on private warehouses. Each discovery provides fragmentary data. More than 70 years after the end of the war, the tracking of Hitler's physical possessions remains incomplete. There is no complete record of what he owned. There is no official list of what was lost. The available figures are partial and shifting. The known objects represent only a portion of his estate. The rest remains hidden, destroyed, or in hands that will never make it public. What remains of his physical fortune is scattered across state warehouses, private collections, and museum display cases. There is no unifying unity. Each object has its own story. Each piece found raises more questions than it answers. The trail of gold, art, and property that Hitler left behind unraveled in the same chaos that consumed his regime. Hidden accounts, banks, Switzerland, and the lost trail of money. As the Nazi regime collapsed, the Allied powers launched a financial operation to find and secure the funds of the Third Reich and its top leaders. Among the priority targets were Adolf Hitler's personal accounts, but there was no roadmap. The papers had been burned, the names used were false, and the countries where the money was hidden were unwilling to cooperate immediately. During his years in power, Hitler accumulated income through various means. Most of it came from the sales of Mein Kampf, which became one of the best-selling books of the century. By law, every married couple received a copy. He also received fees for speaking engagements, use of his image, and party contributions. But the money wasn't kept in official accounts. Private banking entities, trusted names, and mechanisms designed to conceal real ownership were used. The authorities knew that Hitler did not spend his money ostentatiously. He had no large properties in his name or registered personal collections. His houses were linked to the party or the state. His expenses were covered with public funds. The cash he received was stored or moved through third parties. This cover-up network was activated from the first years of his rise to power. The first clues about the destination of these funds emerged during interrogations of party officials. Some claimed that Hitler kept reserves in Swiss banks. Others spoke of deposits in Liechtenstein, Sweden, or Portugal. Vaults in Austria and mobile safes that had been transported south before the Allied advance were also mentioned. None of these versions could be confirmed with firm evidence. In Switzerland, laws protected banking secrecy. Banks were not required to reveal the contents of accounts or the names of holders. Even after the collapse of the regime, bank managers remained silent. Allied authorities requested cooperation but were not granted access to the data. Encrypted accounts and fictitious representatives made it impossible to determine with certainty whether the money found belonged to Hitler or another regime figure. The report by the Tripartite Commission on Enemy Property revealed that millions of marks were transferred abroad in the final years of the conflict. Some of these funds came from state-owned companies, sales of confiscated gold, and trade transactions with neutral countries. There were no details about personal accounts. The money had been transferred in cash, converted into other currencies, and deposited in institutions outside the German banking system. The operations were organized by party officials in charge of economic affairs. They used embassies, consulates, and contacts in private companies to channel the money. Some shipments included jewelry, gold, bullion, and hard currency. They were transported in military vehicles, diplomatic bags, or trains under guard. Some was intercepted. Others disappeared. Investigations indicated that the money was also used to finance escape routes. Several regime officials managed to leave Europe with the help of clandestine networks. Financing these routes required cash, false documents, and payments to intermediaries. Although Hitler could not be directly linked to these operations, some of the money handled by his entourage may have ended up there. In the years following the war, the US government established financial tracking programs. Files were reviewed, bankers were questioned, and transfer data was cross-referenced. But the lack of original documents hampered everything. The names used weren't real. The deposits were fragmented, and many accounts had been closed before any intervention could be made. In Germany, banks were audited. No funds were found in Hitler's name. Accounts he once managed had been cancelled. Others had been emptied weeks before the fall of Berlin. No complete records remained. The entities claimed the documents were destroyed by bombing or burned as a precaution. Investigators were unable to reconstruct the complete flow of money. At the Nuremberg trials, the topic of Hitler's personal money was mentioned but not treated as a priority. The defendants either didn't know or didn't want to talk. The answers were vague. Some claimed he didn't trust banks and kept his money in cash. Others said he had advisors who handled everything and that they were already dead. The truth never fully emerged. It's known that Hitler distrusted financial structures. He didn't use checks. He avoided signing documents linking him to transactions. He had assistants who made transactions on his behalf. One of them was Martin Bormann, another Max Amann. Both handled income, payments, and publishing transactions. But neither left precise records of international transactions. The only concrete amount recovered was the royalties from international sales of Mein Kampf. Payments made from the United Kingdom and the United States were seized under emergency laws. The total barely exceeded $250,000. The money was given to relief funds for victims of the conflict. No other sums were directly linked. During the 1950s and 1960s, rumors of hidden treasure arose. There was talk of trains carrying bullion, vaults under the Alps, and cargoes sunk in lakes. Many of these stories were related to the Nazi milieu, but also included references to possible Hitler assets. No firm evidence was found. Searches yielded no clear results. The money trail also led to South America. Several regime leaders settled there. Although Hitler never left Germany, investigations were conducted into whether part of his funds were transferred to those regions before his end. There was no confirmation. The transfers were undocumented, and the banks provided no information. In some cases, investigators found documents indicating payments from German accounts to companies registered in Switzerland or Argentina. But Hitler was not mentioned. The owners were corporations, representatives, or front men. The amounts were high, but without clear identification. The evidence was insufficient to attribute ownership. Attempts to follow the money trail continued in the 1970s and 1980s. New commissions, journalistic investigations, and partial access to archives generated hypotheses, but not certainties. The sums recovered were minimal. The leads ended in closed accounts, false names, or banks that no longer existed. The documents declassified by the United States revealed that some of the money held by senior officials was used to purchase property abroad. There was no evidence that Hitler had done the same, nor were there records of real estate purchases in his name outside of Germany. The most widely accepted conclusion was that if personal funds existed, they were hidden or destroyed. The few bank documents that survived showed minor transactions, income from royalties, payments for administrative expenses, and movements between party accounts. No deposits worth millions were found. What was documented was the massive destruction of papers in the final days of the conflict. Entire archives were burned in Berlin, Munich, and Berchtesgaden. During the final weeks of the regime, the party's financial officials were ordered to eliminate any documentary link that could compromise Hitler's circle. Contracts, account lists, bank checkbooks, letters of authorization, and transfer statements were destroyed. This systematic elimination blocked any possibility of reconstructing the money trail. In Switzerland, accounts with beneficiaries of the regime remained active but under anonymity. The use of numbering systems and legal custodians prevented the Allied powers from establishing the ultimate owner of the funds. Diplomatic agreements prevented forced access to these accounts. Requests sent by the United States and the United Kingdom were not answered with concrete data. The banks claimed neutrality and customer protection. Some investigations revealed that money linked to the Nazi Party had been converted into Swiss francs, pounds sterling, and dollars. It was then moved to other countries to avoid blockades. Small sums traveled in cash. Larger sums traveled through companies registered in countries without extradition treaties. This chain of transfers blurred the origin. By the final point, it was impossible to link it to the original owner. The system was designed to hide the final identity. Each transaction passed through several filters. Lawyers, notaries, legal representatives, and companies with no real activity were used. The network allowed millions to be moved without leaving obvious traces. This financial architecture was used by the regime's leaders. It could not be proven that Hitler had used it directly, but it was part of the same power structure. Among the names that appeared as possible handlers of Hitler's money were Martin Bormann and Max Amann. The former disappeared during the fall of Berlin. The latter was captured and convicted. Neither provided useful information about accounts. Amann only spoke about publishing income. He said he managed it separately and that much of it had been used for political activities. He had no records to show. The concealment was not limited to Europe. Financial evasion routes included destinations in South America, the Middle East, and Asia. Structures were set up to move capital through consulates, diplomatic networks, and front businesses. Some were used by fugitive Nazis. Others remained active for years, unchecked. But there was no evidence that these channels carried direct funds from Hitler. As the decades passed, banks involved in the custody of Nazi assets faced public pressure. In the 1990s, several Swiss banks agreed to hand over partial lists of frozen accounts. Names linked to regime officials were found, but none with a proven connection to Hitler emerged. The balances varied. Some accounts had been closed decades earlier. Documents declassified by the United States mentioned financial transactions linked to shell companies, bond purchases, foreign currency acquisitions, and payments made through firms located in Switzerland, Spain, and Argentina were detected. The difficulty was proving who was behind each name. Without signatures, without papers, without living witnesses, there was no way to attribute the money to Hitler. The absence of a recognized legal structure after the war made it impossible to claim these funds. Hitler left no official heirs. His will included no detailed instructions regarding the money. The party institutions were dissolved. There was no legal entity that could claim on his behalf. Therefore, the banks had no one to return the balances to if they existed. In several countries, the unclaimed balances were absorbed by the state or frozen indefinitely. Some remain in inactive accounts, protected by anonymity. Others were transferred to reserve accounts. The possibility that part of Hitler's personal fortune remains in unidentified accounts exists, but there is no way to verify it with certainty. The financial system used by the regime was built to survive collapse. Shell companies, trusted carriers, and cross-border transactions made it possible to hide money even without a state structure. This network remained active after 1945, managed by people not under direct surveillance. Without clear names or legal documents, the money could not be recovered. Subsequent academic and journalistic investigations agreed that if Hitler managed to hide part of his fortune, he did so through third parties. There is no direct evidence, only hypotheses based on similar transactions made by other members of the regime. The lack of documentation prevents us from going beyond speculation. In recent decades, efforts have been made to digitize and centralize Nazi-era financial data, but the results have been limited. Many entities disappeared. Others were absorbed by new banks, and the internal archives did not survive. Each thread ends in a blind spot. The lack of documentary continuity prevents establishing a complete line from the origin to the final destination of the money. Hitler avoided the direct use of financial instruments. He did not sign contracts. He was not listed as a beneficiary. He did not use accounts in his name. His entire money management structure was run by assistants. Therefore, when he died, the system collapsed. Without his signature, without his words, without his orders, the money stopped moving. What remained was dispersed or destroyed. Searches organized by governments and independent commissions failed to uncover significant deposits. The recovered sums amounted to no more than a few $100,000, nothing close to what was estimated to have been accumulated during his lifetime. The general conclusion was that the money had disappeared along with the regime. The myth of hidden gold, secret accounts, and ingots in Swiss banks fueled stories, novels, and real-life searches, but confirmed facts are minimal. The transactions were real, the channels existed, the amounts circulated. But the direct link to Hitler was lost amid burned documents, dead witnesses, and nameless accounts. More than 7 decades after the end of the war, there is no solid evidence that Hitler left behind an active fortune. What he had was used, dispersed, or destroyed. The accounts that existed went unclaimed. Banks failed to reveal owners. Governments failed to prove ownership, and the traces that remain are only fragments. The final image is of a system that quietly dissolved, money that moved without a trace, and a central figure who disappeared without a clear financial legacy. What was accumulated was lost among locked vaults, empty walls, and names that no longer exist in any database. The money, like the regime, left more questions than answers. The publishing loot, the money left behind Mein Kampf. The book Mein Kampf was the economic pillar that sustained Adolf Hitler's personal finances from its publication. Written in prison in 1924 and released a year later, the text didn't generate large sales at first. But after he came to power in 1933, the situation changed. The regime made it mandatory reading. Every married couple received a copy as a gift from the state. Every civil servant was required to have one. Every school included it in its library. The publishing house, Franz Eher Nachfolger, was in charge of printing it. Its director, Max Amann, was close to Hitler and handled all contracts. The company, which also controlled other party media, centralized the book's sales. It was in charge not only of printing and distribution, but also of royalty collection, reinvestment, and payments. It was a vertical structure with no external controls. The figures grew year after year. In 1933, more than 1 million copies were sold. By 1940, the figure had surpassed 6 million. Editions varied in size, quality, and price. There were deluxe versions with special bindings, school editions, copies with official dedications, and standard print runs. Everything generated revenue. The profits did not go to the state. They accumulated in Hitler's name, even if no documents bearing his direct signature appeared. The calculation of total income varies depending on the source. Some studies estimate that during the decade of Nazi power, Mein Kampf generated sums equivalent to more than 10 million marks. This money was not audited. It did not go through fiscal controls. It was managed by Max Amann and his team. Some was used to finance party activities. Other portion ended up in Hitler's hands himself. The exact proportion is unknown. The key to this system was the absence of oversight. No one within the regime could question the Führer's personal income. There was no mechanism to regulate the use of the funds generated by the book. Payments were made in cash or by internal transfer. There were no receipts. The publisher was not required to be accountable to any external authority. Abroad, the situation was different. The publishers who bought the translation rights did generate documents. In the United Kingdom, the United States, France, and other countries, the contracts were legal and signed. Therefore, at the end of the war, the Allies managed to seize these accounts. In the United States, for example, payments for sales of Mein Kampf were blocked under the Trading with the Enemy Act. The funds accumulated in those countries were redirected to aid programs. These were smaller sums compared to those generated within Germany, but they were the only ones documented. In total, nearly $250,000 directly linked to international sales were seized. The remainder, generated on German soil or in countries allied with the regime, was never recovered. During post-war interrogations, Max Amann acknowledged that he handled the book's income. He said the deposits were made into accounts controlled by his office, but he couldn't present proof. He claimed the documents had been destroyed. The publishing house's offices were bombed. The archives were burned. There was no way to verify his claims. Hitler never used those funds for visible personal purchases. His lifestyle was financed by the state. The properties he occupied belonged to the party or the government. Vehicles, food, employees, everything was covered by public budgets. The money from the book was used for campaigns, propaganda, political gifts, and representative activities, but there was no central registry. Publishing revenues were also used as an instrument of power. The book wasn't just a text, it was a brand. Giving a signed copy implied a show of recognition. Deluxe editions were given to officials, diplomatic guests, or collaborators. Their value went beyond price. It was a symbol of closeness to Hitler's circle. The Allied authorities knew that this source of money had been key. That's why, after 1945, the book was banned. Copies were withdrawn from circulation. The publishing house was closed. The printing presses were confiscated. In Germany, the publication remained in the hands of the state of Bavaria, which inherited the rights after the fall of the regime. This decision prevented further profits from the text. For decades, no publisher was allowed to print Mein Kampf in Germany. The ban remained in place until 2016, when the copyright expired and the book entered the public domain. But even then, only critical editions, with historical annotations and warnings, were permitted. The original edition remains out of circulation in bookstores. Despite this ban, the text continued to be sold abroad. In several countries, laws did not prevent its distribution. It was offered in specialized bookstores at fairs and online stores. Some governments attempted to block sales but were unsuccessful. The book continued to generate income, though no longer for Hitler or his entourage. Later studies calculated that between 1933 and 1945, sales of Mein Kampf were one of the dictator's main sources of personal wealth. They exceeded any salary, donation, or official income. The ease with which funds were channeled, coupled with the lack of oversight, meant that money circulated freely. In several trials, the book was presented as evidence of the abusive use of power. Forcing citizens to buy it, using public funds to give it away, making it required reading in schools and handing it out at official ceremonies were all practices that favored the uncontrolled accumulation of capital. But none of these actions were specifically penalized. There was no clear legislation classifying them as economic crimes. The model used with Mein Kampf was replicated by other figures of the regime. Some ministers and military leaders wrote texts that were later published by the same publisher. But none achieved the reach or sales figures of Hitler's book. No other generated the same volume of income or had such a structured use as a source of power. The steady flow of money generated by Mein Kampf continued until the final months of the regime. Despite the Allied advance, sales continued. In several regions, local authorities distributed the book as part of propaganda packages. New copies were printed, versions for young people were adapted, and reduced editions were produced. All of this continued to fuel Hitler's personal income. The payments continued to be channeled through Max Amann. He was the only person authorized to manage publishing contracts, negotiate with printers, handle royalties, and sign international agreements. He had full access to the funds. No other figure within the party had the authority to intervene in this process. Therefore, when he was captured, he became one of the main sources of information on the money generated by the book. In his statements, Amann explained that the income was managed with complete autonomy. There were no public balance sheets. There were no audits, no accounts were reported to any state office. The money was considered part of the Führer's estate, even if it was not declared. There was no separation between personal and party resources. Everything was mixed within a single informal structure. This system allowed Hitler to accumulate a fortune without leaving any official trace. Although his material possessions were neither numerous nor luxurious, his accounts were full. Tax returns did not exist. He did not file reports with the Treasury. He did not register any properties in his name. He only handled cash and verbal orders. It was a closed circuit without outside interference. Several documents found after the war mentioned payments made from the publishing house to bank accounts in Germany and abroad, but there were no names, only account numbers, amounts, and dates. The final destination of the money could not be established. These files were used by the Allied powers to compile financial flow maps. But the results were incomplete. Some copies of these records were destroyed by party officials before the fall of Berlin. It was feared they would serve as evidence in subsequent trials. Therefore, the surviving documents were fragmented. The names of the owners had been crossed out. The signatures had been torn off. Almost nothing remained to link the money directly to Hitler. Subsequent investigations concluded that Mein Kampf was not only an ideological instrument, but also an economic one. It allowed him to sustain a flow of capital for more than a decade and was the basis of his financial independence. Thanks to these earnings, he was able to avoid controls, buy loyalties and finance operations without asking the state for resources. This autonomy strengthened him politically. Furthermore, the book generated legitimacy within the party. Each sale was seen as an endorsement. Each copy in a home, school, or government office reinforced his image. The text's commercial success was presented as proof of his leadership. This combination of politics, propaganda, and money turned it into a tool of total power. After the war, several publishing houses attempted to recover the publication rights. They argued that the contracts predated the regime and had been signed under legal conditions. But the occupation authorities rejected these claims. They considered that any attempt to reproduce the book risked ideological dissemination. Therefore, the rights were frozen. The Bavarian state administration assumed legal custody of the text. It blocked any attempt at republishing it. It rejected proposals for critical editions, scholarly editions, or adapted versions. For decades, not a single copy was printed on German soil. This policy was part of the process of symbolically deactivating the Nazi legacy. Even so, the book circulated in other countries. Editions printed in the United States, South America, and Asia reached Europe through informal channels. They were not illegal in all cases. Laws varied by country, but in Germany, possession was subject to controls. Open sale and public distribution were not permitted. Authorities closely monitored the trade in old copies. In the 1980s and 1990s, academic interest in the text increased. Several universities proposed publishing versions with notes, commentaries, and historical context. But legal opposition remained firm. Only after 2016, when the copyright expired, was an annotated edition permitted. It was prepared by a history institute and accompanied by critical analysis. Its distribution outside academic circles was not permitted. This edition was met with controversy. Some sectors supported its publication as a way to debunk the myth of the banned book. Others considered any dissemination of the text dangerous. The government permitted its printing, but under strict conditions. It could not be reproduced without authorization. It could not be sold as an independent work. It could only be circulated as part of study programs. The economic legacy of Mein Kampf is not limited to its sales. It represents a unique case of how a book can be used as a source of personal income by a head of state. No other 20th century dictator managed to turn his own text into a sustained source of capital. No other dictator imposed his work as a mandatory purchase within the state apparatus. The case also demonstrates the weakness of financial controls in dictatorships. Money moved unchecked. There were no limits. There was no separation between public and private accounts. Everything remained in the hands of a small circle. The system allowed funds to be diverted without leaving a trace. And when it collapsed, no documentation remained to reconstruct the path. Researchers agree that much of the money generated by Mein Kampf was lost. It was used, spent, or diverted in transactions that were never documented. What remained was seized, destroyed, or dispersed. There are no active accounts, no blocked deposits, only fragments of records, loose copies and partial statements remain. The book that served as the regime's ideological foundation was also its leader's financial foundation. This dual function made it unique. Through its pages, Hitler managed to generate power, build his image, and accumulate money. When the regime fell, the text continued to exist, but the money it generated vanished among burned files, closed accounts, and dismantled structures. The final division: who got what was left. At the end of the war, Hitler's belongings underwent various fates. Some were taken by Allied troops as war booty. Others remained under the control of military authorities. A portion was claimed by the new German government. But there was no official inventory, there was no clear will, nor were there recognized legal heirs. The last document Hitler signed before his death included some provisions regarding his personal belongings. He entrusted Martin Bormann with carrying out his wishes. He named a few people to receive certain items, but the fall of the regime prevented these instructions from being carried out. Bormann died or disappeared. No one took up the assignment. The most well-known physical properties were seized by the occupying forces. The Berghof house, the dugouts, the party offices, and the Munich apartments were placed under surveillance. What wasn't destroyed by bombing or looting was sealed off by the Allies. Valuable pieces were removed. Personal belongings were placed in storage. In the Berlin bunker where he spent his last days, few valuable items were found. Most had already been removed. Only furniture, used uniforms, scattered documents, and charred remains remained. Soviet troops took what they found. Some pieces were stored, others were used as evidence during interrogations. The Soviets kept these objects in special storage facilities. Several of them were taken to Moscow. There was no public access. Only a few Kremlin investigators knew what had been collected. The material was classified. Pieces with symbolic content were hidden. No photographs were distributed. No communiques were issued. Everything remained secret. In the Western occupation zone, American, British, and French forces also found objects. Many were sent to their countries. Some were displayed in museums. Others were kept as historical documents. There were paintings, weapons, furniture, photo albums, and letters. In some cases, they were sold as military surplus. The German authorities, after the creation of the Federal Republic, requested the return of some property. But they did not provide proof of ownership. In most cases, the objects were no longer available. They had been given to private collections, destroyed or lost. There was no legal basis to reclaim them. As for the money, no active accounts were found in Hitler's name. The banks consulted had no records. Potential deposits had been cancelled. The amounts frozen abroad were used by the Allied governments. There were no return transfers, nor were there any compensation payments. International royalties from Mein Kampf were redirected to aid funds. No percentage was allocated to relatives. Figures from the former regime were not allowed access to these resources. The book continued to generate income, but no longer for Hitler or his entourage. This avenue of capital was permanently closed. Hitler's close relatives also received no assets. His sister Paula was interrogated by the Allied authorities. She stated that she had received no money or objects. She lived in modest conditions. She was not allowed to inherit or claim belongings. The denazification laws prevented any access to resources linked to the regime. Some of Hitler's personal belongings appeared years later in private collections. These included watches, signed documents, medals, annotated books, and utensils bearing initials. Many of these had been stolen from his residences by Allied soldiers. Others were handed in by civilians who found items during the collapse of the regime. There was no legal control over these pieces. The trade in Nazi objects grew over time. Auction houses in Europe and America sold items attributed to Hitler. There was no official verification. The provenance was ambiguous. Dubious certificates of authenticity were presented. Despite this, prices were high. Demand was constant. The market was unregulated. Some governments attempted to curb this trade. They enacted laws to prevent the sale of objects linked to the Nazi regime, but the measures were limited. They were not applied in all countries. Sales continued through private channels or at international auctions. Hitler's material legacy spread uncontrollably. In Germany, the seized property was stored by the Bavarian state. Among them were furniture, manuscripts, paintings, correspondence, and clothing. They were not displayed. They were kept in special warehouses. Some were used as evidence in trials. Others remained sealed for decades. Access was restricted. Only authorized researchers could view them. The state of Bavaria also retained the copyright to Mein Kampf. This custody blocked any attempt at republishing it. The book generated no further income for private individuals. Royalties stopped. Control of its publication remained in state hands. This was a political decision to prevent commercial use of the text. The real estate was confiscated by the German government. The Berghof residence was left in ruins after the bombing. It was later demolished. No reconstruction was allowed. The land was closed to the public. There were no sales or concessions. This was part of the attempt to erase any symbol of the regime. Other smaller residences were given to public institutions. They were used as offices, military installations, or state housing. None were converted into museums. Their preservation was not encouraged. The objective was to eliminate material traces that might attract Nazi followers. A policy of silent elimination was applied. The objects preserved by the Soviets were partly declassified after the fall of the Soviet Union. Some were displayed in temporary exhibitions. Among them were remnants of Hitler's uniform, fragments of the bunker sofa, and dental pieces. Their authenticity was disputed. Russian authorities confirmed their origin. Repatriation was not permitted. The closing of Hitler's financial and material chapter was not formally accomplished. There was no will executed. There was no legal distribution. Only dispersal, confiscation, destruction, or silence. What remained was fragmented without a complete record, a heritage that evaporated with the fall of the regime.